Alright, this next quote is one of my favorites because Steve Jobs spoke about Alan Kay, and those of you who don't know who Alan Kay is, he was one of the founders at the Palo Alto Research Center for Xerox, one of the founders of the GUI. And he basically stated that Alan Kay said those that love to make software love to make their own hardware. And that is true that Alan Kay said that, but he didn't mean it in terms of software completely being limited to its hardware. It means that when you understand software, you understand hardware and you know what to do in hardware. And like what I argue about in my Behind the Bit, there's that hardware out there that you would love to have, but maybe you cannot. The reason why you can't really apply that anymore is that you're running on Intel now with OS X. You could have the argument and say, well, look, we have a more spectrum of saying this other hardware is giving that alternative closer to what we want back in the PowerPC days. But since you're running on Intel, that's pretty much game over on that side of the things. But Alan Kay stated this. He said, now that you're selling Macintosh, you're a software company, not a hardware company. Because the thing that makes the Mac different from all other computers is nothing in the hardware, but it's in that ROM. What you're selling is services, communication services between human beings, and what computers can do for them. When you're in the software business, you have to run on every platform. So you must put the Mac operating system on the PC and put it on the Sun workstations and put it on everything else. So that was something that Alan Kay had said. It was something that, because he really had worked closely and was a fellow of Apple, so on and so forth. And I think expresses it very nicely. Then we come to John Sculley, who was actually against cloning and had many. Bill Gates I sent him many a memo, of which he did not answer. And basically, Sculley had, this was in an interview of Fortune, and he was saying, it took me a lot longer than I expected to learn how to be really effective. I just wish I knew as much 7 years ago. And this is referring to his first year as chairman, as I do now. His biggest regret, allowing Apple to guard its technical breakthroughs jealously, rather than licensing other computer makers to build Macintosh clones. Because customers were willing to pay more for the Mac's unique ease of use, built-in networking, and nifty industrial design. The strategy guaranteed fat profits for years, but it trapped Apple in a niche. PCs that use Microsoft operating system software meanwhile captured 90% of the market, as thousands of independent hardware and software developers flocked to Bill Gates' DOS standard. Slowly, but inexorably, Apple's technology advantage eroded. And that's what I'm talking about, guys. See, if you were to put OS X out there on the other PCs, that's what I'm talking. You would get those of you that say we're limited in GPUs or whatever. That they would flock to you because you're on a larger base. You're moving much faster. You're simply just larger than what you are now, what Apple is now. And that drives much more revenue because it builds partner. See, people always are so limited in thinking it's just OS X, they're going to be sold for $100 and something. Wow, whoop-de-doo. That's not really the real money. The real money comes in with these developer back channels and partner back channels that you get with the OEMs. It's a tremendous amount of money that most of the time is just sheer, pure profit. Not only that, all the different application suites that you develop, and it's an exponential number for software. And when it grows at the pace of beyond selling one Mac at a time. That's why you can't just sit there and simply tell me that it's just $129. I don't even know what the price would be, but the costs or the back doors that none of you really even see. You have to be in the developer communities and live it, and probably many of you do, and know what I'm speaking of in terms of that revenue coming in. The other is, well, the hardware sales are going to decline. Well, the reason why I'm not so worried about that, Apple's Mac sales were pretty much on an even keel. it exploded when they switched to Intel. So if let's say Intel it never happened, there would probably be a slow up and down of Macintosh, because Apple's always really done well with a user base, a very, very, very loyal user base. So I'm talking about this surplus of customers that have come in when I speak about sales at this point, okay? Because we have a sheer jump going from really late 2006, 2007, when the Intel switch was complete. Boot Camp came in April of 2006, and pretty much Mac sales took off, because I advocate that many of that surplus is not really buying OS 10. They're buying Macs because Windows users, or people who are consumers in general, they buy Dells. Why do they buy Dells? Why do they buy HPs? Why do they buy Gateways? Oh, look at Apple. I'm going to go buy an Apple. OS 10 is a benefit, and certainly a certain percentage of them are going to be buying OS 10 for that reason. But let's throw in a wrench to that. If they're all going to buy the surplus of consumers I'm referring to again, if they're all going to buy Macs for OS 10, why weren't they flocking to buy Macs from 2001 to 2006? Where were those surplus of consumers that exist today? Why weren't they there back then? They weren't buying OS 10 then. Even a few years ago, just before the Intel switch, they weren't buying them. But they're buying them now. Then I have people say, well, it's iLife and all this other stuff. Okay, iLife was introduced in 2003. Why weren't they flocking? Why don't we have this surplus base then as we do now? People will say the iPod halo effect. The iPod started in 2001. It just so happens that the numbers jump. Intel switch. Bam, there it goes. Sure, there's going to be users that switch back and forth. And there are going to be people that have Windows or whatever. See, my thing is that there shouldn't be a reason to run Windows on a Mac. OS 10 should be large enough as a software platform that it has all the application it needs to go back to Windows and say, well, I have that too. But it doesn't. And many times people bring work home. I would say the majority of the clients that I have their work stuff at home, and therefore if their work has this standard, their home computer has that standard. And that's another reason why OS 10 has to get out there and start even getting more so in the workplace, so that it can also benefit on riding on that horse. For those that have OS 10 at work, must have it at home in those applications as well. You're selling services in the end. The application is the end of everything. And it just goes serves that all the problems that plagued Windows in its past, people still went to it. Even though Apple still hung in there, it went to it because they put up with all of the problems of Windows because it had the applications they needed. And what an opportunity cost shift in their heads they're thinking. So with all the software that you can argue and people wanting to go to OS 10 and iLife and all that, and certainly a percent of them are, they weren't there before the Intel switch, but they're there now. And I just don't think I don't like the idea of running Windows on a Mac. OS 10 should be sufficient in the applications it has. And so I say to myself, the only way to get it more applications and services is to get it out there even more so. Okay? So I know I kind of digressed because we were talking about hardware sales or loss. Well, like I said, we're talking about that surplus. I always think that there's always going to be a baseline Mac that is going to be purchased. But let's be frank, there's only two desktops, and you can't count the Mac Pro. The Mac Pro is a workstation class computer, and it has a price tag to go with it. And really the Mac Pro is extraordinarily competitive against HP and Dell. It's many times cheaper than an HP and Dell workstation. But true desktops, you only really have a Mac Mini and an iMac. And those of you that really support Apple, on that front and saying, well, you know, these are great, and there certainly are great products. You have to understand, consumers are consumers, and they're always right in terms of what they want. If they don't want an iMac or a Mac Mini, they don't really have much of a choice. Now, that is to say that desktops have been on the decline in terms of the revenue share, and laptops have been just, you know, shooting through the roof. Now, they're trading places. It's not like an expansion of one and expansion of one. Desktops are switching in terms of revenue for laptops, and I also have an article on that. So what I argue in terms of why I don't think hardware losses would be that, sure, there's probably going to be some loss, but it's not going to be, you're never going to lose the loyal base, and you're going to maintain a piece of that surplus. That's the jump from 2006. You're not going to keep it all, but you're going to keep a good chunk of it. Will it hurt? Will it hurt Apple in terms of that hardware sales? What I say to that is, hardware profits have a unit fixed cost of the actual material and inventory itself, whereas software has huge profit margins versus the hardware. They don't have the same logistical chain in terms of profit margins. You can make a tremendous amount of profit on software and all the things that I just told about, and the back ends and things like that. But to add to that, the iPod is really the thing that saved the diversification of Apple, really abandoning the Macintosh as its primary product and moving to other products is what has saved Apple, more to the point to where the iPod is the single largest revenue source for Apple. I wonder why. Could it be that it runs on every platform, that it's open and already set free? It runs on Windows and just about anything that Apple can throw out there. It's got it all. They don't need to set the iPod free. It's already free. It runs on everything. It's just ironic that that's the largest base product supporting the revenue. I mean, the numbers are as such that 35% of quarter 1, 2009 is Macintosh. The rest is just the iPod. And it's 10% for desktops and 25% for laptops. And I will give you the article for that as well in the description. But I also argue that, look, who else has a Mac Mini and who else has an iMac? I think HP has something to the alternative. But people, if you're really going to tell me that you can't sell a Macintosh without OS X, you really have a bad opinion of the Mac. Lord, I could give you tons of things. Their build quality, number one, the peripheral technology that they give you, your form factor that they give you, the art that they give you. One of the major reasons why a Mac, and I don't say it's pricey, a Mac is a fully featured computer. They just don't let you strip it down to make it cheaper. They're giving you a fully featured product, and you pay for those features even though you may not use them. That's why I don't say they're overpriced. Are they expensive to some other computers? Sure, but for what you get, it's extraordinarily competitive, okay? So, but not everybody wants an iMac, and not everybody wants a Mac Mini. However, they are two unique computers, and its uniqueness drives demand in itself. Also, with the MacBooks and MacBook Pros, Lord, most of the time they're very tiny, light, extraordinarily high quality build and form factor. Webcams and all of the output peripherals are awesome. So there in itself is good enough reason at hardware alone to go buy a Mac. And again, if you're going to be on this whole cheap thing, you got to answer on why everybody else survives that are not cheap, and their own lines that are even more expensive than the cheapest computer out there do very well for years on end. And I really feel, because we studied this in economics, that when you answer that, you'll understand why Macs will continue to sell. They're going to maintain that base and a pretty good chunk of that surplus customer base that has come from the Intel switch. They're not going to maintain it all, but boy, are they going to grow in a huge revenue share from software, from licensing out OS X, and get even bigger. And that's where I'm coming from on that front. Okay, okay, I want to bring in something from the whole perspective of Apple losing its technological advantage from protecting, and that is OS X right now advocates its benefits over Windows, but there is a day, just like it happened in the 90s, hardware technology then got paralleled, and then Apple's technological advantage eroded. The same thing can happen within software. See, Windows is already learning how to deal with its viruses and its driver problems. As soon as a lot of the OEMs, which Itanium chipsets and the EPIC architecture has already done so, and other boards and other parts, in small part OEMs are doing that. They're doing the whole EFI on up. For Windows, they can cut out a lot of the mess for the drivers and really make it a marginal argument. As far as viruses are concerned, Vista has already really completely and utterly shut down a tremendous amount of system exploits. We're not talking about fooling the human, okay? We're not talking about tricking somebody to download something, because that can happen on any operating system and there really is no defense. Thus, the human being is the weakest link in a system defense. But in terms of operating system weaknesses and exploits that existed, Windows Vista has done a tremendous job in comparison to its predecessors. And Windows 7 has even built upon that even more. What that means is you're eradicating a lot of that history that these Apple commercials are using. Windows had a lot of that bad past, but it's changing. And there's going to be a day that both of those arguments are going to be marginal. It parallels the erosion. You just can't keep something protected and expect no one else to catch up with you. It just doesn't work out that way. So I would say Unix and Linux as two great examples of that, especially in the enterprise space. So it's not going to be like that forever, guys, and you can shake your head in disbelief, but I've tested a lot of this stuff on Windows 7. They've already done sandboxing on drivers. I've seen it catch its firewall prevent a lot of older exploits on it. I've tried some other tactics on it, and I'm very impressed so far with that. There's other things that they can work on, but those main arguments that you get in the context of the ads are not going to be there forever. So that is really maybe a question that one can ask. Okay, when that day comes, and it's coming soon, what do you then advocate if you haven't already licensed out and you're selling at the pace at one Mac at a time? Certainly, it's can probably continue to sell, but wow, the dominance of Windows further strengthens its hold over our behavior in our world of software, really.